Okay, let, let me begin. So, uh, I talked last time entirely at the conceptual level about how we could understand um, differential adequacy of conceptual schemes, as it were, from within the conceptual. And my claim is that although this isn't the way Sellars does things, he needs some account like that. And I'll try and say where I think he needs that. But today we're going to look at picturing and at the way he tells the story. But I think first it's worth looking at the genre that he's working in, looking at the framework of questions and issues that he's working in. And here the slogan I find most helpful is conceptual appearances. Sellars himself in chapter 5 of Science and Metaphysics mostly talks about Wittgenstein and the Tractatus as his point of comparison. But as always with Sellars, certainly in the book as a whole, and as I think we've seen in his view as a whole, it's Kant that we have to keep our eyes on. And it was with that thought in mind that instead of having us read more Sellars this week, I had us read these two essays. And so the one is by Louis Seibert, who wrote what I think is the currently definitive work, doing a point-by-point comparison between readings of Kant and Sellars, placing Sellars in the space of interpreters of Kant, looking at sort of detailed issues of interpretation and so on. And the essay that I had us read is an adaptation, basically, of the 5th chapter of this book on called Intentionality in Sellars, a Transcendental Account of Finite Knowledge. Chapter 5 is the picturing chapter. That's sort of the core of it. But if you are interested in Sellars as a reader of Kant, I recommend this Seibert book. You've gotten a taste of it in the essay. It's not an easy book. Even the essay is not so easy. He's careful. He's knowledgeable about both sides of it. That was why I extracted passages so we could get a sense of what I thought was the key elements of it. The Simonelli book essay, I think, is lucid on its own. I didn't think anybody would need the help of extracting passages from it. I'm going to be relying a lot on Simonelli's approach here. And in particular, his account of the issue in Kant that Sellars ends up having a very finely articulated and interesting approach to. And that's what I'm saying. Let's think about that under the rubric of conceptual appearances. So I talked 2 weeks ago about the notion of appearance. The big sea change from thinking about the appearance-reality distinction in terms of resemblance to thinking about it in more abstract terms of representation. The transition I want to talk about today is from thinking about appearance as a matter of sensibility, thinking of appearances as sensuous appearances, as what is delivered by our senses, to thinking of appearances as what's delivered by our concepts, by the way we understand things instead of the way we observe things. I mean, I take it the home language game of talk about appearances is sensuous appearances. But in Kant, we get the idea that the world we understand, the intelligible world, the world that's in conceptual shape, is itself necessarily an appearance of how things really are. That how things really are is not something that's in conceptual shape. That's why we need a transcendental theory to tell us about the relation between appearances in this sense, as conceptually articulated, appearances of something that is not, of non-conceptual things in themselves. And that's the idea of transcendental semantics. So Simonelli here, I think, is a good guide. And he takes Peter Strawson's Kant book, The Bounds of Sense, as his foil. So it starts off, let's look at Strawson as a reader of Kant's theoretical philosophy. Let's look at Sellars as a reader of Kant's philosophy, both happening in the 60s. Strawson's book almost single-handedly responsible for a revival in the interest of Anglophone philosophers in Kant as a theoretical philosopher. And half a decade later, Rawls comes along and says, oh, and the practical philosophy should be at the center of our concerns as well. So I think Simonelli compares and contrasts Sellars' reading with Strawson's reading on 2 points. And I think he's right about both these points, and that this is a good conceptual framework for thinking about them. So the first is that Strawson is what's come to be called a two worlds theorist of the transcendental semantics of the first critique. That is, he thinks there's a world of phenomenal appearances and a separate world of things in themselves. This is roughly an ontological distinction that sees appearances and things in themselves as two different kinds of things. And this contrasts with what's come to be called a two aspects theory. This is Henry Allison, his terminology, a two aspects reading in which we think of there just being one kind of thing. There is what there is, but we can consider it as it shows up in the context of our cognitive abilities, faculties, capacities, and so on, or think about it independently of its relation to our cognitive abilities. This is roughly an epistemological distinction. So there's one kind of thing, but we can think of it as it shows up, as it were, filtered through our cognitive capacities, or we can try and think about it not taking into account anything about our capacities. And as Simonelli reports, I think this is just right, these days the two aspects reading of Kant is dominant. Not that there aren't people pushing the other line. Former colleague Anna Jawernik, for instance, has a sophisticated two worlds account. But by and large, I think the Allison approach, people are now working with variants of that. That's very familiar background to some of you, but I mention it for those of you for whom it's less familiar. And Simonelli's point is, Sellars is a two-worlder. He thinks there are two separate worlds. Well, maybe at the end of the day, we've got the one world showing up in the two regards. But along the crucial dimension, he thinks there's an ontological disjunction between appearances, things that exist only in our representations of them, as he put it, and the things that exist in themselves. The second point that Simonelli makes is that Strawson thought of Kant as a classic phenomenalist, as someone who thought we're presented with sensuous appearances, sense impressions, and use the conceptual apparatus to build a world out of that, to find objects standing in relations, constituting facts, and so on. Sees the world of appearance, Strawson does, as still not just phenomenal in the sense that it's the world as it appears, but the world as it appears sensuously, as it appears through our sense capacities. And while Sellars agreed with Strawson on the first point, two worlds, not two aspects, though it's anachronistic to really confront either of them with it. This is sort of before the two aspect readings. They're together on that, Strawson and Sellars, writing in the middle 60s. But on this point, Sellars understands Kant way better than Strawson did. And that is that appearances for Kant are conceptual appearances. The smallest unit that he looks at of the sort of least conceptualized representation is intuitions, which Sellars understands on Kant's behalf as this such as, this cube, this pink thing. They're already the product of our conceptual capacities. And there's a famous passage, it's Sellars' most famous Kant passage, in which he says there is only one unity, the same faculty that brings unity to the manifold of our representations, brings the unity to the manifold of intuitions and to the intuitions themselves. One of the reasons, one of the dimensions along which McDowell follows Sellars' reading is, when McDowell is reading Kant, is that he thinks of intuitions as this such as, and the advance to judgment is to something of the form, this is such. From this cube to this is a cube is the advance to judgeable conceptual contents from things that are already conceptually contentful. Yeah.
I have a question on this interpretation of Sellars as two-word theorist, because for Sellars, the distinction comes from appearances as common sense common sense word, and things in themselves as scientific theoretical words. But when he first distinguishes common sense from science, the science is defined in terms of theoretical and postulational approach. And when he introduced the idea of theoretical entry, he was quite strict. It's not ontological distinction, but merely methodological distinction. But if this idea is taken seriously, isn't Sellars more close to two aspects rather than two words?
Okay, fair enough. When we're thinking of the contrast between appearance and reality as the contrast between our common sense conceptual framework and the Peircean conceptual framework of the ultimate the objects of the ultimate ideal science, you're absolutely right. Those are ontologically on a par. But that's not what Sellars means by reality. He means by reality a collection of material particulars. And we can refer to those particulars singularly, one by one, or in a kind of plural way. But all there are those particulars. And they are not, as the real, as the things in themselves, conceptually articulated. So he's got a distinction, as Kant does, of two worlds, one of which is in conceptual shape and the other of which is not. Now, there is this other dimension to him. He has a two-aspect of his view and a two-world aspect of his view. And there's a passage at the end of the Simonelli chapter. Let's return to the basic problem of how we can make sense of ourselves as knowing the structure of objective reality if thinking cannot touch the real. That's the slogan. The real, the in itself, is indeed not graspable. At least it's not graspable in the sense in which a conceptual content is graspable. It's a different kind of thing. That's the two world. Nevertheless, particular happenings unfold in certain patterns, and our languagings can picture those happenings as they unfold. That's sort of where we're going to talk about this. Insofar as a picturing relation obtains, the structure of reality can be immediately grasped through grasping the structure of the space of concepts conferred by a linguistic practice that pictures it. So here he's trying to get both aspects of this. So ultimately, insofar as we're capable of modifying our language, and as a result our conceptual repertoire through scientific development, it's possible for the world we will conceptually represent in experience to be an appearance of the real world. And so, this is Simonelli still, though I've spoken of Sellars' picture of the phenomenal and noumenal, the conceptual and the real, as a two worlds picture, this claim is best understood as a claim about the phenomenal and noumenal at our stage of conceptual development. Though we start out with a conceptual order according to which a two worlds picture is apt, we may aspire in doing science to end up with a conceptual order according to which a two aspects picture is more apt, such that we can talk about things in themselves, both as we represent them and as they are in themselves. So, yeah, the story is going to be more complicated at the end of the day. But trying to set the stage for this conceptually, nobody before Kant could ask the question that Kant and Sellars are trying to answer about how to understand the relation between the world as it is in itself and the world as it appears to us concept-using creatures, the world as we understand it conceptually by applying conceptual contents to it. Descartes, who makes the giant step towards a notion of representation to understand the relation of appearance to reality, also runs together under the heading, this broad heading now of representation, sense impressions and thoughts. Sense impressions, which, as the tradition conceived them up to Kant, not conceptually articulated, and the thoughts as conceptually articulated. And says, well, those are both pensées, they're both cogitationes, they're both representations, and put them on a par there. And as Kant, when he's talking about his own achievement, invites us to think about it, both rationalists like Leibniz and empiricists like Hume step beyond Descartes in thinking of representations of those two kinds as on a spectrum, on a continuum that has thoughts at one end, conceptually articulated, sense impressions at the other end, not conceptually articulated. And from this point of view, it doesn't matter whether you thought of the sense impressions as confused, indistinct, muddled thoughts, the way Leibniz does, or thought of thoughts as thin, faint impressions, sense impressions, from which many distinguishing features have been left out. That's how you get from particular triangles to the idea of triangle, is to leave out some of the things you can see when you see any particular triangle. And those are two different ways of broadly thinking about a continuum that has thoughts at one end and sense impressions at the other. And it's not that they didn't realize that there was a big issue about how to describe this continuum. They spent a lot of their effort doing that. But what they didn't have was the problem that comes up for Kant, thinking about the real as not in conceptual shape at all, and yet grasped through our conceptually articulated representings of it. How is conceptual understanding of a non-conceptual reality intelligible? This is the question that Hegel asks on Kant's behalf in the opening paragraphs of the introduction to the Phenomenology. And here, though it's kind of long, I'm just going to read what Hegel says about this picture. For if knowledge is an instrument to take a hold of the absolute essence, the things as they are in themselves, one is immediately reminded that the application of an instrument, a conceptual scheme, to a thing does not leave the thing as it is, but brings about a shaping and an alteration of it. So if you think of our conceptual capacities as an instrument or a tool to apply to the reality, well, then it changes it somehow when you put the tool to it. Or if knowledge is not an instrument for our activity, but a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again, we don't receive this truth as it is in itself, but as it is as altered by the medium, as it appears in the medium. I mean, these are both metaphors, the metaphor of the tool, the metaphor of the medium, but the point is either one, when you think about our faculties, they're changing. What becomes available to us after the application of the instrument or the tool is different from what we started with. In both cases, we employ a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end, or rather the absurdity lies in our employing any means at all. This is Hegel. Because if you're changing it, if it arrives at you differently, then you're not knowing how it really is. He says, to be sure, it does seem that an acquaintance with the way the instrument or the medium functions might help overcome this difficulty. So here's a sort of cartoon Kant. He said, well, that's why we have to focus on our epistemic capacities, our cognitive faculties, and see how they, what are they doing to it. For then it would seem to be possible to get the truth in its purity simply by subtracting from the result the instrument's part in that representation of the absolute which we've gained through it. We sort of subtract the effect of this if we understand it. But how does that help? This correction would only lead us back to our point of departure. If what you started is not intelligible in itself, not graspable with concepts, then the fact that it shows up in concepts, and if we somehow could subtract that, we'd be back to this unintelligible stuff. Okay, so he goes on about this. Hegel's own response is, look, the only way knowledge of the real through concepts is ever going to be intelligible is if we understand the intelligible is already in conceptual form. We've got to have conceptual articulation on both sides. Now I'll refer to that thought in 2 weeks when I suggest modifications that I would recommend to Sellars' way of understanding things. But we're going to put this to one side now. It's not the way Kant and Sellars go. They have the task of making intelligible the idea of our conceptually articulated representings, giving us a grip on how things which are not themselves construed as conceptually articulated are. I mean, on this picture, the one Hegel is criticizing, the idea of conceptual appearances is the idea of a distinctive kind of misunderstanding. The state of understanding itself is a kind of misunderstanding, essentially, because it's presenting to us in conceptual shape something that isn't in conceptual shape. Now, here, I think we get a helpful clarity from Sellars, who tells us what he means by something being in conceptual shape. It's to be situated in a space of implications. That's the shape of the space of reasons, and it's occupying a position in that space that it is to be conceptually contentful. To talk about conceptual content is to talk about the role something plays, the position it's in this space, this network of implications. But how are we to understand locating ourselves in such a space, applying a concept, as understanding something about the way things really are, if the way things really are isn't in the shape that we can grasp by knowing our way around this space of implications. Now, this notion that by applying concepts, by understanding something, by the fact that what your cognitive capacities deliver to you is an understanding, something that's conceptually articulated, that you're thereby getting things wrong, misunderstanding. This has consequences on down the line. The notion of a political ideology, for instance, is the idea of that something, say, political power relations, are essentially mispresented, misunderstood, if they're understood conceptually. That's just a gesture at a notion of ideology. It's essentially downstream from Kant. You couldn't have that worry about political ideologies if you didn't have the idea of conceptual appearances, which just as such might be errors or build in a misunderstanding, just in virtue of being an understanding, a conceptual understanding. I mean, I mentioned briefly when I was doing the breathless history of the concept of appearance and reality that Plato made a substantial move relative to the sort of ordinary sense of appearance. The coin looked elliptical to me, the tower in the distance looked round. Visual appearances here, sensuous appearances, in that Plato was the original two-worlder, right, who said the things that appear to us sensuously are a different kind of thing than the thing that we grasp intellectually. The things that, though it wasn't one of his words, we could say, the things that are in conceptual shape, that are immediately intelligible, they're a different kind of thing. Denizens of a different world, the world of being, not the world of appearing. But he didn't have this problem, because for him, the intelligible world was the real world. The one we grasped conceptually, that was what there really was. So he wasn't in a position, two-worlder though he was, seeing conceptual and non-conceptual as distinguishing the worlds. It's only when you flip that with Kant that you have this issue. Now, the world of appearances is the conceptually articulated one. That's the medium in which we live and move and have our cognitive being. And the question is how that can be anything like a veridical appearance of something that isn't in that shape. Okay, so that's a framing. As Simonelli tells the story, and I think he's right, Strawson didn't see that as the Kantian issue. He wasn't a good enough reader of Kant to see this, to see the move that he'd made in introducing the notion of essentially conceptual appearances. And we live in that post-Kantian world now. And Sellars obsesses, I would say, about this issue. And his three-part story is an intricately articulated response to it. I say his story is in three parts. The first part, I would say, is the bit he doesn't really talk about. That's what I was talking about last week. That's entirely at the conceptual level, making sense of the idea of ideal science, ideal natural science, that in accord with the Scientia Mensura, as I suggested it be amended, that in the dimension of describing and explaining material objects, natural science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it's not. Well, which science? Well, not the science as of right this minute, the eventual science. And you need to be able to make sense of that notion. That's one piece of his story, is the development of science that we take to be giving us a better and better story about, picture of, understanding of what there really is. And that thought is one of his central motivations, to make sense of that scientific realism. Second dimension, and on that diagram that I hope you'll be able to consult, because I'm going to talk about the details in it, is the horizontal dimension of that diagram that has on the left our norm-governed inferential practices, discursive practices, and on the right, natural linguistic objects, something in the real order, the material order, consists of material particulars, And there the overarching slogan is, norms induce regularities. Now we got to fill that in. But that story, norms induce matter-of-factual regularities concerning material particulars. That's the second part of the story. And then the third part of the story is that vertical column on the right side, the picturing relation, which is a relation between material particulars or constellations of material particulars. On the one hand, picturing items, which are linguistic items, natural linguistic objects, he says, sign designs, he says, he's invoking there what Wittgenstein means when he invites us to think of the signpost considered just as a piece of wood, apart from what it means in virtue of its being caught up in, playing the role that it does in our practices of being guided by these things and using signposts to guide other people. There is just the piece of wood that's there. And the words that I speak are also noises. The words that I write are also inscriptions in ink. Those are the natural linguistic objects, the sign designs. And what we have over on the right is a relation of them picturing, standing in a picturing relation to the non-linguistic material particulars that in some sense we use them to talk about. He insists that in some sense use them to talk about is not ordinary semantics, not empirical semantics, but transcendental semantics. That whole picturing relation we have to talk about in the ultimate Peircean conceptual framework. But we're to understand it as an entirely non-conceptual, matter-of-factual relationship. That is, it's the kind of thing that natural science talks about, not the kind of thing that we can talk about in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary that talks about what we're doing when we do Peircean science. That would have to involve normative talk and so on. When we put those three stories together, then the relation between the conceptual contents and the pictured objects, that's the sense in which what we grasp, our concepts are about what there really is, are representations of what there really is in a Kantian transcendental sense. The sense that Kant thought there is such a relation, but we're not in a position to say anything about it. Only God would know about it. And when Kant says, only God would know, he means never mind. Not going to help us. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about today, is what's epitomized in that diagram and the way what's in that diagram relates to the story I told last time, which was about how to understand the Peircean theoretical material object vocabulary that is the one we have to use to talk about the picturing relation. But of course the question is, well, how do we bootstrap out of that conceptual framework to talk about to understand the matter-of-factual relation that can be formulated in it. And now, here I want to remind you, as we go into this discussion, of the distinction between sense dependence and reference dependence that I introduced a couple weeks ago. In general, if a philosopher uses the term independent, you should grab your wallet and make sure it's still there. But more constructively, should ask, well, what sort of dependence exactly is being denied? Because there are lots of kinds of dependence. And in particular, is it dependence of one conception or concept on another? Or is it the dependence of what we're talking about with those conceptions? Reference dependence, there can't be the one thing unless there is the other thing. So there can't be parents unless there are children. There can't be children unless there are parents. That's a reference dependence relation, at least as kinds. There can't be nails unless there are hammers. It's not just you don't know what a nail is unless you know what a hammer is. It's not a nail unless you can drive it with a hammer. I only mention that for you people with Heidegger in mind. There are reference dependence relations in there in the equivalent totality as well as sense dependence ones. But, and the key point is, there can be dependence of the concepts that don't entail dependence of what they are concepts of. And the example I find most helpful in this case is response-dependent concepts, where one concept is defined in terms of somebody's response to something else having a certain character. So I wouldn't endorse this as an analysis, but people have thought of beauty as the property that something has if it causes pleasure to suitable observers of it. So call it beautiful star is something that disposes competent observers to feel pleasure when they observe it. In that notion, beauty, star, is defined in terms of the response of pleasure. So tending, disposing to pleasure is what's meant. Does that mean if there's no observers who can feel pleasure, that there's no beautiful sunsets? No. The sunset could be beautiful in that if there were, as by hypothesis there is not, a suitable observer there, they would be disposed to feel pleasure at it. If I define a super Earth as a planet that has 100 times the mass of the Earth, then the concept of a super Earth is sense-dependent on the concept of the Earth. But it doesn't mean that if the Earth had never existed, there wouldn't be any planets that have 100 times the mass of the Earth. That's just the way I've picked out the reference of this concept. Long story, well, anyway, looking ahead, Sellars says, one of the passages I worried about last time, how the criterion of the correctness of the performance of asserting basic matter-of-factual proposition is the correctness of the proposition qua picture, i.e. the fact that it coincides with the picture the world cum language would generate in accordance with the uniformities normatively controlled by the semantical rules of our language. Thus, the correctness of the picture is not defined in terms of the correctness of the performance, but vice versa. So he's saying, actually, what makes one conceptual scheme more adequate than another is that it's a better picture. Well, that's not the way I defined the notion last time. I said, no, we've got to have an intraconceptual notion of better or worse, and of some way of projecting that to a superlative, or at least a notion of convergence for it. That notion of the Peircean conceptual scheme is something the Peircean conceptual scheme, as it figures in picturing, is sense dependent on, but not reference dependent on. It had better happen that at the end of the day, when we've bootstrapped ourselves into assessments of better and worse pictures, that it turns out that when we said one conceptual scheme, one stage in the development of science was a more adequate conceptual scheme than an earlier one, it better turn out that by its own lights, it pictures so that according to the Peircean conceptual scheme, the more adequate one pictures more adequately than the less adequate one does. But that picturing relation is not reference dependent on the existence of conceptual schemes at all. In particular, not dependent on the existence of the Peircean conceptual scheme, which is a good thing because he reminds us there isn't any such thing yet, and maybe never will. And what he's saying doesn't depend on that. It's not reference dependent on some eventual Peircean conceptual scheme. We're using that notion to specify what we're talking about when we talk about picturing. There's a sense dependence, but not a reference dependence there. Now, that probably isn't all crystal clear at this point, but I'm saying that's why I want us to have that distinction in mind. I think it's crucial. Okay, let's look more closely at the diagram. You'll see lions and mammals and reptiles show up 3 times, but they show up differently. At the bottom, there's no quotation marks, and it would have been better if I'd put little pictures of lions and mammals and reptiles there, because I mean, Leo and Leona and the actual particulars there. Above them, quotation marks around them. I mean the sign designs, and that's a very special kind of quotation mark. We don't, our ordinary quotation marks don't go all the way down to the sign designs, typically. For instance, ordinary quotation marks, you can only put real words in them. McDowell, in his wonderful essay on quotation and saying that, talks about how you have to expand the notion of quotation that we usually use in order, for instance, to properly say, and the singer said, quote, wop bop loo bop wop bam boom. That's using it to indicate sort of the noise that was made rather than the word. And if we want to argue that the Polish word ja, J-A, meaning I, is not the same word as the German word ja, meaning yes, we're going to need to use special quotation marks that individuate the words, not by the sequence of letters that are in them. These quotation marks, though I used sort of ordinary ones, Sellars sometimes uses asterisks for this purpose, but we mean the actual tokening of the noises and the inscriptions there. Over under the conceptual contents, the lions, the mammals, the reptiles, they're in dot quotes. And we know how to read those dot quotes. They're distributive singular terms expressing norm-governed functional classifications of those expressions. Now, I've written them with the dot quotes. Remember, dot quotes are distributive singular terms. So, quote, wrote is a dot red, and quote, rouge is a dot red. Singular terms, distributive singular terms, on the model of Leo is a lion. But they're formed with the illustrative sign design principle. Remember this, it's going back a couple weeks. That is, you form a dot quote which gives you a distributive singular term that applies to all the expressions in any language that play the same role as the example that you've given. That's the illustrating sign design. When I do that, I have to do that in my own language, in the language I've written the dot quotes. So it's got to be dot red. And I've specified that functional role by giving you an example of something that plays that role in my language. That's the illustrative sign design method of forming distributive singular terms. You put those two together and you get distributive singular terms expressing functional classifications. You put those together and you get his notion of dot quotes. And I think it's important here that we do have the illustrative sign design principle in play, because it tells us which sign designs it is we care about in the other, at the other end of this relation. It's the sign designs of which this is an instance in our own language, in the language in which we specified these conceptual roles. So all of that, I guess, was a commentary on look carefully at the kind of quotation marks or lack of it that's in the diagram here. And the principle that's going to tie all this together is the one on the diagonal at the right of the diagram. Natural linguistic objects, sign designs, lead two lives. On the one hand, they're bearers of conceptual content. The conceptual content that you would get by putting dot quotes around them, letting that sign design be the illustrative sign design of a dot quoted of a distributive singular term picking out a functional classification formed using dot quotes. They lead two lives. They lead a life in the conceptual world of conceptual appearances, but they're also just marks and noises, inscriptions, episodes in the causal order. And so they can be talked about using the language of natural science to talk about material particulars. This leading two lives is a 50s trope, famous popular book, I Led Two Lives, Communist and Counter Spy, about somebody who joined the Communist Party for the FBI. Sellars is much better than Quine at keeping the Cold War out of his rhetoric. Quine is always using examples in the 50s. Yes, but Ortcut's a spy. Who is it in your community that you think is a communist spy? I think Ortcut is. Quine actually seems to have been like that. Sellars is a man of the left, not, but he can't help himself from invoking this leading two lives trope here. Anyway, this isn't citizen and counter spy or communist and counter spy. This is I lead one life expressing conceptual contents, standing in relations of implication, reason relations, but also just as events in the natural world. So that's the hinge point there. And the overall strategy, and both Seibert and Simonelli are reliable guides to this, is, well, the norms that govern our use of expressions, which is all there is in virtue of which they could express concepts, our use of them to make claims and challenge and defend those claims by giving reasons against them and reasons for them, which is where the relations of implication and incompatibility, where they're abstracted from. The norms that govern our use of those expressions, what we take to be a reason for and against what, that is what we take to be, to imply or have as a consequence what, or to be incompatible with it, to be a reason for it or against it. Those norms induce regularities in the occurrence of these natural linguistic objects. The noises we make are different because of the norms that we have. If the norms were different, the regularities governing the utterances would be different. So if it follows from the author of this book being Hegel, that the author of this book was an idealist, then in acknowledging a commitment to Hegel having written it, one has committed oneself to an idealist having written it, and ought to acknowledge that, at least if the question comes up. And so a regularity between the occurrences of Hegel and of idealist will be induced. Now, I want to say a number of things about this. It is a subjunctive dependency, and you'll see a line saying that. Lion implies mammal, that's the blue dotted arrow, and it's incompatible with being a reptile, and being a reptile is incompatible with being a mammal. Those reason relations normatively govern our talk. And if the norms were different, then the patterns of use of expressions lion, reptile, and mammal would be different. That's a dependence of the patterns relating the inscriptions to the norms governing, well, the use of the inscriptions of things of the same type as picked out by illustrative sign designs that we use to identify these. So that's a subjunctive, I call it a meta-dependency of the patterns governing, the patterns exhibited by the sign designs on the normative dependencies that are codified in these relations of incompatibility. Now, it's really messy. Right? What are the patterns that are induced in these utterances by our norms? I mean, I don't go on chattering about what other commitments I acknowledge every time I make a claim. You know, there's a whole lot of them. I say, Hegel wrote it, so a German wrote it, so someone who is dead wrote it. There are all kinds of things that I'm committed to there, and there aren't tokenings, sign designs that go with all those things. Not even the covert thinkings rather than sayings. I don't think about all those things. There's a kind of idealization here. Sellars says we have to think about a mode of projection. And a way of thinking about it is, that he suggests, is imagine an indefatigable robot who every time it makes an inscription, lightning now, or lightning at P at T, immediately writes down its conclusion. So thunder at P at T plus delta. Every time it makes a claim, it goes off and writes down a whole lot of the consequences and writes down the negations of things incompatible with it. It could do a lot better than we do. And he says when we're thinking about these patterns, it's not the actual patterns of the sign designs. It's the ones that we project according to the mode of projection of norms governing our use into productions of these things. So he doesn't say a lot about that kind of idealization, but he says this is why it's not a simple isomorphism we're talking about. It's a sort of second order thing because you have to use this subjunctive dependency to extrapolate patterns of the utterances that you would have if we drew all the consequences and explicitly acknowledged the incompatibilities. Or maybe if we had, the million monkeys, each one of which extracted some of the consequences, and then we looked at what all the monkeys together, had come up with. An observation I can't help but make in the current day and age is that basically what you do with large language models based on applying machine learning to big data is trying to go backwards from the actual inscriptions that you see to learning the norms that would have induced this pattern of actual inscriptions. All it's got to go on is the actual inscriptions. And yet what it needs to learn to be grasping the concepts is the norms determining the mode of projection of the rational conceptual structure onto the matter-of-factual structure of, well, there was this sentence and then this sentence came after it. So maybe that was extracting a consequence from it, or anyway, it's the sort of thing you say next. So, there's a story to be told about a method of projection here. But his thought is, if we take the constellation of natural linguistic objects that would be produced by our norms, if we projected them and filled them all in, so that everything you could say and should say actually got said, that then there would be a genuine isomorphism, he thinks, with the particular objects that we were observing and describing and reasoning about using those things. We've got errors of, I'll say mistakes of errors where we do something wrong. So the noise we make isn't actually what it ought to be given the norms. And omissions where there ought to be an acknowledgement of a commitment here, but we don't actually do it. So we've got to think of the norms as projected through this method of projection to a set of occurrences, tokenings of natural linguistic objects, idealizing away the errors and the omissions in them. And then look at the relation between that and the actual objects, the particulars, the non-linguistic particulars. Okay, now I haven't said anything about that relation yet, the actual picturing relation. There's complications about this projection, but Sellars is trying to fill in an understanding of what it means to say that we can, well, fill in a way of understanding how conceptual appearances of things relate to the non-conceptual material, merely material things that they are conceptual appearances of. They have to be appearances of those things, And they have to be conceptual appearances of them, things we can grasp by practically navigating in that space of implications and incompatibilities. We want to understand what it is for something to be a conceptual appearance of something non-conceptual. By putting these relations together and looking at the composition of them.
I had a question going back to the slogan that norms induce regularities. I was wondering if for Sellars there's also a sense in which regularities partially induce norms. I was just to give a good example. So ja in Polish means something different from ja in German. But I see that this is at least partially a matter of people using that sign design in different ways in different communities. Is Sellars in a position to acknowledge, like, is there a kind of two-way attendance here?
Gee, that's not the example I thought you were going to give for of the phenomenon you indicated. I mean, he can say, yeah, the Polish ja is a dot I, and the German ja is a dot yes, and both of those correspond to being governed by different norms, playing different functional roles with respect to. I mean, those are complicated roles compared to Leo the lion, say, but that he can say. But what I thought you were going to say is, well, surely it's important that the regularity, lightning at P at T and thunder at P at T plus delta, that regularity feeds back into our norms. We learn to count to decide, okay, it was that, when should we expect the thunder given, where the lightning actually was. Our norms reflect these patterns of relations among the items. And he wants to say, yeah, and that's sort of the converse of the picturing story. And that's why that there be this relation between that he's trying to dissect and unpack is a transcendental condition of the possibility of an empirical language. It's got to be that those picturing relations are reflected in our norms. For the concepts to be of or about material empirical objects. Okay. So, in general, the picturing relation, I think, is also best understood, at least to begin with, in terms of subjunctive dependencies. That is, what we're looking for is that if the relation among the objects had been, the non-linguistic objects, had been different, then the relation among the sign designs would be different, precisely by feeding back through the difference in the norms that there would have been. And that's something we have to understand in terms of the development of the language. So, an example I've mentioned before that Sellars uses in some of his earliest writings is if I have a toy concept of an acid that has the circumstances of application that anything that tastes sour is an acid, and the consequences of application that if something is an acid, then it'll turn litmus paper red. Then that concept has this inference, this implication curled up in it, that anything that tastes sour will turn litmus paper red. And insofar as that's a good implication, that's a good concept. But it's empirically fragile. I might find something someday that tastes sour, but it turns litmus paper blue. And I can see blue isn't red, those are incompatible things. Because this tastes sour, I can infer that it'll turn the litmus paper red, but what I observe is that it's blue. That's nature telling me I can't have that concept. And now maybe I say, oh, well, maybe it's only clear liquids that taste sour that turn litmus paper red. And it's because this was a cloudy liquid that it didn't. I get a more articulated empirical concept. And we find, with real concepts, a concept of temperature has got a whole lot of different circumstances of application for saying that the temperature of this is higher than that. We have many ways of measuring differential temperature and many consequences from it. And mature concepts, those are mostly actually going to go together. That if one of them implies the other one, if one of them gives you the verdict that A has a higher temperature than B, then the others will as well. And if one of them, if one of the consequences holds, then it's very likely the others will as well. But they develop because we can always be in the position that we were in with that toy concept of an acid. So through a mechanism like that and the development of more adequate by their own lights conceptual frameworks, because that inadequacy of the toy concept of acid, that was by the lights of the people whose norms these are. It's their notion that red and blue are incompatible properties of the litmus paper. If it turned it red, then it didn't turn it blue. That's by their own lights. It's their own norms that are telling them they have to evolve here, have to change what they're doing. Maybe they said, oh, maybe the light's funny in here and it really was red. Various things they could try, but they've got to, by their own lights, change something. Okay. But the picture is that that underwrites a feedback loop whereby if the patterns or regularities of the material objects were different, then our norms for using expressions would be different. And so their projection onto the patterns and regularities exhibited by the natural linguistic objects would be different. That's a subjunctive dependency of the picturings on the pictures. Now, that's going to be formulated in the Peircean conceptual scheme, because that's where we can talk about, by hypothesis, can talk about the material objects as they really are, and can talk about the sign designs as they really are. And can specify the regularities as they really are. Now, it's a huge qualification on what I've been saying, that where I've talked about subjunctive dependencies, Sellars is committed to being able to specify regularities in non-alethic modal vocabulary, in vocabulary that Hume would have approved of. That's why Sellars uses the term regularity. That's what Hume thought he could make sense of. Okay, every time I've seen an A, it's been a B. That regularity is something Hume could get his mind around. What he didn't see was how to move to that to talk about A's necessarily being B's, or there being a law that if it's an A, it has to be a B. Couldn't understand what was put in those subjunctive modal terms. And Sellars, thinking that what's expressed by modal vocabulary is metalinguistic, thinks it's not in reality, as we're eventually going to find out that it is. Regularities, yes, but not subjunctively robust dependencies. Now, mostly I want to talk about what he does allow under regularity, given this part of his nominalism, next week. That's sort of the theme there. How crippling is this? What can he do? What are his strategies for doing that? But I want to say here, as I understand him, his story is going to be, we can use the expressive power of this alethic modal vocabulary as a ladder to climb up on, and we can kick it away afterwards. Or less metaphorically, what he says about picturing is going to be sense-dependent on what you express using alethic modal expressions, but not reference-dependent on it. We're going to use this to pick out use the modal language to pick out the regularities, but we won't be committed to those regularities depending on there being, in reality, subjunctive dependencies of the multiple kinds that we've seen are in play. There's subjunctive dependencies in picturing relation, there's subjunctive dependencies in the relation between the conceptual contents and the sign designs, and in the method of projection. So I'm going to take a break, take our break now, but I don't want us to lose sight of the overall picture. So I said, there's this new philosophical problem that basically nobody before Kant could have about the relation between the way things appear to us concept users, the way they appear in conceptual shape when we make claims and have thoughts on the one hand, and a reality that's understood as not being in conceptual shape. And that raises a problem about the sense in which we can intelligibly understand ourselves as having conceptual appearances of the way things really are. That's a general issue that arises for the first time with Kant. Because of all these complexities, what if Descartes had not run together, had just invented representation but not run together things in these ways? There are all kinds of contingencies involved in our sort of becoming aware of these large possibilities. But anyway, this issue is new with Kant, and Sellars thinks we need, 15 moving parts put together. This diagram is leaving out the progression within the conceptual schemes to the Peircean conceptual scheme. He really wants to dissect this into its components to give us an intelligible notion of conceptual appearances of a non-conceptually structured world. So all this fussing about the details is to try and fill in a detailed response to the Kantian problematic. Okay, why don't we take our break, come back at 2:40, and I'll talk about some more machinery that I think can help us do this. Okay, so one of the pieces that Sellars needs in his puzzle is a relation of picturing between, at the world end, material particulars and whatever sorts of plurals of them were allowed, whatever sorts of groups of them were allowed. I said, I want to talk more about that next time. But we got the material particulars as they're specified in the Peircean framework. And at the other end, and those are non-linguistic items, most of them are non-linguistic items, and at the other end we have the linguistic sign designs, the ones that lead to lives. Well, we have the constellation of them that resulted from the mode of projection of the norms governing the use of the concepts. And we want to know what this relation is. And I think the principal criterion of adequacy for his defining that is that we have to be able to understand more adequate conceptual schemes as better picturing schemes. Now, I suggested that we couldn't use the picturing for this purpose because we need the Peircean conceptual scheme in order to specify this. And so the best we would be able to do is assess conceptual schemes, and now we have to think about future ones. Well, how would their history look to them if they specified a picturing relation in their best terms? And my claim was, that's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one, because it isn't that hard to have some, by our lights, degeneration of the conceptual scheme that is sufficiently successfully self-congratulatory that if things are as it takes them to be, it turns out we've been getting better and better at finding out what they are. That was why I suggested the technological forward-looking and so on, that we needed an independent way of specifying the Peircean conceptual framework to make this thing work. But it's a necessary condition on that when that scheme looks back at previous schemes and assesses picturing, that it sees not just it as the best picturer, but basically seconds our judgments, or the ones we were projecting, about which were more adequate conceptual schemes along the way. That has to show up in better picturing. And here, Sellars talks about isomorphism, but none of these things are going to be that. If we're looking at the inadequate schemes, look at the Peircean scheme looking back at us, in particular as picturing. We want to be able to see our view, our common sense view, but now the way he's using that includes our scientific views, as genuinely picturing what there really is, but not as adequately as we will eventually picture it. And here I think there's a bit of subsequent conceptual apparatus that Sellars didn't have access to that I think he could usefully have used to say what I take it he was after with this thought. So that's what I wanted to say something about. And that is the sort of picture of functionalism that we get from David Lewis and that is the basis of the Canberra Plan, or anyway, the collection of things that the Canberra planners endorse. And that proceeds, well, in two large phases. You take the thing you're trying to understand and divide its vocabulary into two, a constant part and a variable part, and you put variables in for the variable part and preface it all with existential quantifiers. So you Ramsify is the terminology, the slogan for this. You Ramsify the original vocabulary. And that's the vocabulary you're trying to understand, your target vocabulary. And you're going to do that, this ramification, what it results in is a specification of the functional roles played by the variable, the things you replaced with variables. I'm just waving my hands here. I'll come back and be a little more careful about it in just a minute. And then you go to your favorite vocabulary and use that to specify best realizers of each of the roles as specified by the Ramsified theory. So if you, in the original version of this, Lewis starts with a theory, a vocabulary that he's puzzled by. It has some observational terms that he's not puzzled by, so he holds those fixed. Treats the others as theoretical terms, pulls them out, puts variables in for them, not just singular term variables, but predicate variables too, if you like. Lewis actually is happy to do it just with singular terms. And take the content of the theory to be, well, there are things that are related to our observables in these ways. And then you go to your favored vocabulary, the one that you do understand, and find the things specified in your favored vocabulary that best realize those roles, such that if you plug them into that Ramsified version of the theory, you get something that's true in your privileged vocabulary terms. If you do that with the division between the fixed terms and the variable terms being, you fix the observational terms and the theoretical terms are Ramsified, then the sentence you get expressing some theory is the Carnap sentence of it. And this was his use. If you just have some division between fixed and variable vocabulary, then it's the Ramsification of that variable vocabulary. And the Canberra Plan, Frank Jackson is probably the best known proponent of this, and it's downstream from this Lewisian way of understanding functional terms says, let your puzzling vocabulary be the vocabulary of, say, folk psychology that attributes beliefs and desires to people and explains what they do by attributing to them sample pieces of practical reasoning. Well, I believe it's raining and I desire to stay dry, so I believe that if I open my umbrella, it'll keep me dry, so I'll open my umbrella to make sense of that. You say, that's fine. I understand the things he does. He opens his umbrella. I understand it's raining. It's this believes that and desires that. I don't understand those bits of vocabulary. Okay, pull them out. Put placeholders in for them, variables in for those terms, existential quantifier in front. You've got a Ramsified version of that theory that just says what functional roles are played by those folk psychological terms, but we're giving a causal explanation. It's because I was in this state 1, believing that it was raining, and in state 2, desiring to stay dry, and so on. That caused me to open my umbrella. Okay, I understand that. That didn't get Ramsified. And now my favorite vocabulary is the vocabulary of neurophysiology, let's say. And now I want to know, specified in neurophysiological terms, what substituents can I give for each of these states? What are the best realizers specified in my favorite vocabulary for being state 1, being state 2, and so on. And this is a holistic assignment. I've got to find a set of best realizers, an assignment to the variables of the Ramsified version of the theory, of things I can specify in my favorite vocabulary. But that's then what I'll say makes true this claim in the folk psychology. And if you look at Jackson's Locke lectures, say, he explains how he wants to say that, wants to divide potentially problematic vocabularies into the ones you can tell a story like this about, in his favored terms, which are going to be physicalistic terms. He's not being as careful about what that means, how to project the ideal science and so on, but with a rough and ready version of it. He said there's the ones you can reconstruct in these terms and the ones you can't. And the ones you can't, I say, well, you're not really talking about anything, at any rate, not about anything real. There isn't, in my physical terms, a best realizer of the Pegasus role, for instance, and that's a way of saying Pegasus doesn't exist. And for the other ones, well, they are rough and ready ways of talking about the things that I specify in my privileged vocabulary. Those are the truth makers for those statements. That's the overall apparatus. Canberra plan is to do that sort of for everything that's problematic. Either say, we can't get good enough realizers, it's nonsense, or find the best realizers for it in our favorite vocabulary. And I'm thinking that what Sellars is after with assessments of comparative better and worse conceptual schemes, accordingly as they are better and worse picturers of the way things really are, can usefully be thought of in these Ramsification plus best realizer terms. So the way we're to think about our conceptual appearance, our, I mean, common sense and contemporary science, our conceptual scheme now the way we're to think about it as a conceptual appearance of what there really is to take the preferred vocabulary to be the Persian vocabulary. That's what we're going to look at for realizers of the roles. Now, though, Sellars says not the functional conceptual roles on the left side of the diagram, the ones we'd express with dot quotes and so on. That would be one kind of functionalism, but that's not what he wants us to do. He wants us to take the roles played by tokenings, instances, occurrences of sign designs that are the picturing material particulars, now with the qualification that although there is a core of actual tokenings that we look at of our terms, in fact, the roles that we're trying to find best realizers for are roles in the method of projection of our norms, filling out the actual utterances that we make, because we don't chatter enough about, red here now and lightning there then to get a complete set. But we project all of those virtual utterings of productions of sign designs, inscriptions, noises, whatever, and specify the regularities among them in Persish and subject to whatever nominalistic scruples we have about what those regularities can be, but we can do that in Persish. And now find the items in Persish corresponding to the utterance inscription, lightning at P at T. Now, that we make, and then, thunder at P at T, so lightning at P at T plus delta. And the coordinates, those are going to be really easy to find Persish equivalents of, we think, the space-time specifications, so locations of demonstratives and so on. Those are really easy to find Persish realizers for. And we've got causal relations or explanatory relations, anyway, the regularities corresponding to them in there, where we use terms like thunder and lightning. Even our best natural science, the meteorologists are going to use whatever their terms, whatever their preferred terms would be. And the Persish terms will be different for them, but they'll probably have pretty good realizers for lightning and thunder and so on. The picture projected from us will be much better than the picture that the ancient Romans and their talk about lightning and thunder had, as measured in Persish by finding the best Persish specified realizers of the roles in as projected by the method of projection of our norms compared to the projected occurrences of sign designs and regularities among them projected by the realms of the norms of the Roman scientists or meteorologists. And one advantage of thinking in these Lewisian functionalist terms, ramification plus best realizers, is that it builds in, under the notion of best realizer, builds in the sort of more or less. That's what's needed for comparisons of conceptual schemes. And there's a requirement of a satisfaction of a quasi-empirical prediction here that the judgments of better and worse conceptual scheme, of transitions that are progressive conceptually, that we make from within the conceptual schemes when we're looking at them, that ought to track. We ought to get the same comparative judgments when we do this ramsify and find the best Persish realizers for the items corresponding to the sign design occurrences that are the result of projecting the norms. Everything's going to be described in Persish there. Now, I say that's quasi-empirical because there doesn't need to actually be any Persish ever, and these modes of projection only give us virtual tokenings. I mean, I should have said that idealization we should think of that, the idealization that is the method of projection, the way in which norms induce regularities. We should think about that as specified in Persish as well. We might not have a perfect picture of that, but the scheme that we're looking for an isomorphism to non-linguistic objects specified in Persish is going to be, well, you can think of virtual utterings as a specification of a place, a time, a speaker, and an utterance type. That's the space that the projections are going to be in, that we're then finding the Persish correlate of. So they might know more about how to project various norms than we know too. So modulo are not knowing exactly what regularities are or what vocabulary we're allowed to use in articulating these regularities. I think this is a coherent notion that he's got, that he has at least colorable stories about each of the components of the diagram and the background that I've suggested we need for the diagram, and that it gives us something to mean by transcendental semantics in the sense of a story about the sense in which, although we might be substantially wrong about many of the things we say, it's nonetheless intelligible that in this transcendental sense, we're talking about things that really exist, at least with much of our talk. Some of it, no doubt, not, and some of it's not picturing very well. That's why we have an inadequate conceptual scheme. But he's got a description of a reference-like relation between things in the conceptual order and things that are not in the conceptual order. The sort of thing that Kant said, well, all you could say is that there is some such connection, but it's not, that's not something knowers could ever know anything about, finite knowers could ever know anything about. Now, when I think about criticisms one might have of this view, again, for the moment, bracketing questions about the nominalism that is not bracketable insofar as that's really his motivation for saying that what we're talking about isn't in conceptual shape, and so setting criteria of adequacy for the account. But at least in that regard, I think he's true to Kant. It's just, I think Hegel's criticisms of Kant on this point were well taken. When I think about Sellars' story as elaborated here, the biggest threat to it, it seems to me, is an argument that Rorty gave in a different connection, which was an argument against causal theories of reference, or really against theories that treat reference, denotation, and so on as an objective matter of fact. And that was the following. We're understanding that we're making holistic mappings of the concepts in picturing. Here, the objective relations that we're talking about, picturing relations, the matter of factual regularities that underlie the isomorphism. Well, the isomorphism, it's a holistic thing. You can't do it piece by piece. It's a matter of how all the pieces fit together. And Rorty's complaint against empirical semantics, against causal theories of reference as an instance of theories that take reference relations to be objective, not dependent on our interests, and so on, is that the most fundamental distinction a semantic theory needs to make is between terms that refer and terms that don't. And that's to say that there's a line to be drawn. Some things we're to say, if we look at terms where we say, well, by our lights, say our Persian lights, the lights of the people who are doing the semantics, most of what you say using term A is false. You have just a lot of false beliefs about these things. And most of what you say about B is false. But actually, in case A, you really are talking about something that exists. It's just you have wildly false beliefs about it. And in case B, your beliefs are so wildly false that you're not talking about anything. Actually, you're just disconnected from it. There just aren't any witches. And we ask, well, so for phlogiston, is that a way of talking about oxygen, but it just says a whole lot of false stuff about it, like that under certain circumstances it can have negative weight? Or does the term phlogiston just not refer to anything at all? And Rorty's claim was, in hard cases, that is not going to be an objective matter of fact. It's just going to be a pragmatic matter. Well, what are the advantages of treating it the one way? What are the advantages of treating it the other way? There isn't a fact of the matter about whether this term really refers to something, but we use it to make almost exclusively false claims about that, or no, we're just so far out of bounds we didn't manage to connect to anything at all. Now for picturing, Sellars is committed to there being an answer to that question. On the best scheme, what does our term such and such picture? Some of them don't picture anything. Some of them do, but this is one of the places where we have the most inadequate conceptual scheme and still have all these, it turns out, false beliefs. Now, on the scheme I was suggesting, where that comes back to is the judgments about best realizers. Is there a good enough realizer of this role specified in Persish? Or do we just have to pick between a bunch of really bad realizers and say, no, they're so bad that there's nothing pictured here? Well, I mean, that looks to me like the right place to put the question. That's the shape of the question. But it's really important to Sellars that the story he's told makes picturing relations something that there's a scientific fact about, an objective fact about, something you can go into the laboratory and find out whether this regularity holds or not. And I wonder if the judgments of picturing are essentially holistic and functional, not now in a way that involves norms. We're talking about functional roles in the ramified sense, and that works whether any of the predicates or connections that you're holding fixed are normative or not. And the picture is, well, they're not in the Persish story. So there's no norms in the Persish language. So we're not talking about functional roles in that sense. There isn't a worry about going metalinguistic here. But if what pictures what ultimately is a matter of best realizers as specified in Persish, does that support the objectivity rhetoric, the claim that these relations are matter-of-factual relations among material objects of the sort that we can expect natural science to give us the truth about eventually? Or is it essentially messy in a way that ultimately involves concept application and the sort of messy things that we do there? Anyway, that's the most pointed way of asking this question I can think of. And I find the ramification plus best realizers vocabulary for hooking up pictured items via picturing natural linguistic objects, eventually to the conceptual appearances. That's supposed to be an objective matter-of-factual relation. And this is the most pointed way I know to put pressure on that. And I think that that's relatively independent of how rich a vocabulary we find Sellars committed to or we're comfortable using to specify the various regularities. Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out how Sellars' picture fits into the overall, into the large-scale difficulty, the content difficulty that you started out with, which is that we're trying to use conceptual concepts to represent something which is non-conceptual. And I guess I'm wondering, I'm going to frame this as sort of like an objection. It looks like, okay, so we describe the picturing relation and the way in which norms induce regularities all like first-ish. But first-ish is the language, it has a conceptual scheme, and so there's the worry that, well, first-ish is misunderstanding reality by using even an ideal conceptual scheme to represent something which is non-conceptual. And if first-ish is misunderstanding reality, why should we care that we can do all this stuff with first-ish?
Okay. I mean, we're supposed to, this is the image of climbing up on the Persish ladder and then kicking it away, because everything we're saying about picturing is sense-dependent on Persish, but it isn't reference-dependent on it, is the claim. Because what we're talking about is what Persish is talking about. Persish is the one language in which the picturing relation is essentially trivial. According to its mode of projection, there just is a literal isomorphism between the lions out there and the tokenings of Leo and Leonina and so on. And it's that, what the way Persish pictures things, that is the non-conceptual thing that's grasped perfectly by Persish in the sense, in this transcendental sense of it pictures it perfectly. In the stronger sense, well, it's adding stuff that isn't in the world in the narrow sense, just because it's a conceptual scheme. And so what it says, you can only say in a conceptual scheme, and most of that isn't in the world in the narrow sense. But its singular terms all pick out things that are in the world in the narrow sense. And it does a sort of, I mean, the question is whether when we say Leo is a lion, meaning Leo is one of the lions, singular and plural, and that's a one in many that isn't universal and a particular, well, is that a this such? Is that Leo the lion? Leo is a lion. This lion. Is that letting the conceptual back in through the back door? Or if not, is it too weak to even be a referential picture? I'm not going to settle that next week, but that's sort of the issue, is how to do that. And not to keep all the cards hidden, answering that question is what drove Sellars to his process ontology. That may sound like it's not making things any better, but that is, as the second Simonelli paper will teach us that. But anyway, so another way of putting this, kick away the conceptual side, is picturing relations are sense-dependent on Peirce-ish concepts, but they're not reference-dependent on it. Well, that's the story. Has he entitled himself to say that? Has he told a story according to which picturing relations, I mean, they're not picturing relations unless there are some concepts to be used, because these things have to be not just natural linguistic objects, they have to be linguistic objects. It's not a picturing relation unless there's a conceptual scheme. There has to be an actual conceptual scheme. But it's only the conceptual scheme as inducing these regularities that gets invoked in defining the relation that is a picturing relation if the way those regularities are induced is by the norms of using expressions. I mean, this is so conceptually delicate, what the rules of the game are and what he's entitled himself to here, that, I am by no means, confident in my footing in describing this, but I'm trying to speak for it as best I can.
Is it accurate to say that, or yeah, is it accurate to say that our worries about the use of concepts to understand something that's not conceptual stem from the possibility of our concepts being not picturing correctly? And so once we reach the Peirce-ish conceptual scheme, we don't have that worry anymore, and so we're all good. Is that a way of thinking about things?
I mean, I think that that's true, but that he's making claims that go beyond that. He still thinks that what's expressed by alethic modal vocabulary is essentially metalinguistic. And because of that, it's not in the world in the narrow sense. But concept users are in the world in the narrow sense, but their concept use isn't except insofar as it's pictured in it. That is, the norms and the classifications and all of that stuff, they are not in the world in the narrow sense. Only material correlates of them, the things they picture, are. And I see this, it's very hard to know just what the rules of the game he's playing are, and so whether what he said has entitled himself to say these things. On the other hand, what is one to say to Kant? Where did he go wrong? I'll urge, Hegel was right, you have to understand the world as conceptually articulated, but are the alternatives really Sellarsian picturing or Hegel? Admittedly, I have a particular version of that, but for instance, in denying that facts are in the world in a narrow sense, does that drive Sellars all the way to a world of particulars and thin regularities among them? If you go the other way and say, no, it is a world of facts, well, then are you saying, well, you're saying that reality is conceptually structured, and, that's the Hegelian alternative. Man muss Kant oder Hegel sein. That the slogan of German philosophy. You have to take your choice, either go with Kant or with Hegel. Well, on this issue of granting that the notion of conceptual appearances gets a grip. Our representations are conceptually articulated. How are we to understand what it is we can understand and know by means of these conceptually articulated representations? Is it really, well, if you think the world has facts in it, then you've got to see the world is conceptually structured. And if you deny that, then you have to go with a world of particulars and, not even any subjunctively robust connections among them, no properties, no facts, no laws. Is it really that stark? But one of the reasons I'm interested in Sellars as a metaphysician is it seems to me he's both raising these issues, giving us conceptual apparatus to think about them, and characterizing an approach and trying to carry it through in a way that teaches us lessons about it. I'm in the end, I don't see my way to the bottom of this, so this is going to be frustrating, but sometimes it's about the issues, not about the views. Okay, well, you see what's sort of left over for next time. Also, I want to address then the issue which has been hanging over us for a while, in the dimension of describing and explaining. That's where Persish is, that's where you get the material things and so on. Well, but what is that? Describing. We got a necessary condition on describing. Describing instead of labeling requires location in a space of implications. But that's true of anything that you can put in the form of a declarative sentence. And Persish doesn't do that because there are normative statements that are declarative sentences and stand in relations of implication. So what is the narrower notion? I've mentioned this is what Hugh Price calls the bifurcation problem. If you want to be a descriptivist or representationalist about some bit of language, but not all of it, if you're an anti-descriptivist, how do you draw the line? How do you bifurcate and say, well, you should be a descriptivist about some things, but, well, which of those? Hugh's own view is no, got to be a global anti-descriptivist. But Sellars is not taking that line. So I'd like to address that next time too. And then the week after, I'd like to say sort of how I think about these things in the conceptual on both sides of both the representings and the representeds are conceptually shaped, and how can you do that without being wacky? That's the view. Okay, very fine. See you next time.